Matthew chapter 10 is where we're going to work on tonight, or at least it's where we're starting at. Again, this is my little outline of the book to kind of give you a roadmap of where we're working. You won't find us anywhere else because I made it up. That's the reason everything is so blocky. I make everything in blocks. I guess that's how my brain works. But it's the easiest way that I found to try to explain where we're headed in this book. And so, first 4 chapters are introduction. The last 3 are conclusion, 26 through 28. And then you have a series of 5 sermons. And then you have stuff around each sermon to try to fortify or transition to the next sermon. So, like 2 weeks ago, we were working through the Sermon on the Mount, and in last week's material, 7 and 8, or 8 and 9, 8 and 9 focused on the conclusion of what was taught in the Sermon on the Mount. So tonight we're talking about what's called the Missionary Sermon, or I call the Empowering Sermon here, because I wanted everything to start with E, because that's just what preachers do to help us remember everything. But this is the Missionary Sermon, and the thing about the Missionary Sermon is, for the longest time, I thought this was the weakest of all the sermons because it just didn't do much for me. I was all about Sermon on the Mount. I was all about 23 and 24 and the destruction of Jerusalem and the return of Jesus. That all excited me, this idea of sending out 70, or in the book of Matthew, sending out the apostles just out locally to preach and then come back. It didn't seem like that big of a deal to me. So this seemed like one of the lesser sermons until I really started studying it and started figuring out how this worked as far as how Matthew's putting it together. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. Now, as you open up chapter 10, and this is really showing you where we're going, Jesus calls to himself the 12 disciples. And as he calls these disciples together, this is the first time in the book of Matthew that we've seen all 12 together. You remember we picked Peter and John and Andrew and James. And remember in chapter 9, we picked up Matthew, 9:9 is where we picked him up. But here we see all 12 put together. And so what I attempted to do on the outline sheet is try to, this is Leonardo da Vinci's Lord's Supper. You can find this in different places, but it's located in Rome. And the reason I like it is Da Vinci tried to do a personality study of each apostle. And so as you begin looking at which apostle is which, you see a lot of interesting things. John is the youngest, and he is going to be on the side of Jesus, but he's leaned away. He has longer hair. And so he tried to make him very young that way. You see Simon the Zealot and Matthew are arguing. And you see a lot of different looks on each one. And so Da Vinci really, I started to say Leonardo DiCaprio, but he hadn't been in this movie yet. This is Leonardo da Vinci. Each one of them had their own personality and such. Now, you go down through there, you have your inner circle. 3 of them that are the closest, and who are they? Do you remember? Peter, James, and John, right? And those are the ones that go to the Mount of Transfiguration. Those are the ones that go to the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus. They're the ones that are just always there. Now, 11 of the disciples came from the area around Capernaum, which we know as Galilee. There's only one that came from the same region as Jesus. He'd be a distant cousin of Jesus. We don't know how back in that line it goes, but that would be Judas Iscariot. And so Judas, as far as culture and as far as bloodline, was closer to Jesus than the rest of them. And Judas also was the keeper of the money, but we see as we read through the Gospels that Judas tended to steal out of it. He tended to be very judgmental towards others. And of course, he's famous because he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And so he betrayed him. But what you see here as we get started, these apostles are mentioned, and these apostles are brought together, and these apostles are sent out on a journey to preach the gospel, to teach, and maybe, I guess you would say, to practice what they're about to do, to practice what they've seen, and to practice all these things that are about to go on as we look through here and as we see these things. Now, the apostles. We look in Acts chapter 1, what were the qualifications of the apostles when we chose one after Judas died? He had to be with Jesus ever since his baptism, throughout his ministry. And what else?
After resurrection, they had to see him.
Yeah, seen him after his resurrection. And they also had to be specifically chosen by God. And so the lots were cast, and of course Matthias was chosen, and he became an apostle as well. So these apostles held a very important place. Now, as we get started on this missionary sermon that we're about to talk about, let's back up and maybe we'll look at it from a different angle. That's what I'm doing tonight. That's the reason I'm seeing it a little different. Back up from a different angle. What you see here are some specific directions, and yes, the directions have to do with this trip, but you're going to see it sure looks like it goes a lot deeper, because he's going to talk about persecution, going to talk about everything else which happens. When was the book of Matthew written? Do you remember that? I mean, not physically remember. We're not that old in here. But it was written, depending on who you listen to, somewhere in the mid-60s, early 60s. I've seen dates as early as 56. Most people say about 62, 63. So Matthew came out about the same time as many of Paul's letters. And you could move this 10 years earlier. I don't think you can move it much back. Otherwise, the Matthew 24 doesn't seem to make as much sense if you move it much back, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So if you say, let's just say 60s, this is 30 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And what has happened to many of these apostles? Especially James. James, the brother of John, is beheaded by the king or the local official there. And you can read, or easier to do nowadays, Google Fox's Book of Martyrs and ask what happened to each one of these apostles. And this book was written 1800s, maybe late 1700s, I think the 1800s, but it's considered to be pretty reliable source material. It will tell you where each one of the apostles went and also how each one of them died. And so Matthew at this point, of course, has not died, but likely a third of the apostles were dead by this point. Maybe half of these men would be dead when Matthew is writing this. And Matthew may have well known the end was sort of coming for him. The only apostle who did not die a martyr's death, in other words, was murdered for his faith, was John the Apostle. And so 11 of them are going to be stoned, skinned, dipped in burning oil, thrown from the top of the temple. 4 of them are crucified in one or the other different ways in which they were creative and how they'd kill people. Several of them were beheaded. A lot of these apostles had either just died or they would soon. And hearing this is going to, in recognizing Matthew is thinking of this while he's writing this, is going to light up a lot of what we see when we read chapter 10 and also as we read chapter 11 with John the Baptizer. And so that's going to kind of stick out a little bit. All right, so here we go. We're sent out here in chapter 10, starting here in verse 5, and they're told, you go and preach, but you preach right here in these cities. Don't go north to where the Gentiles are up in Syria. Don't go east to Decapolis where the Gentiles are. Don't go west or south where the Samaritans are. You stay right here in this area, in this group of about 4 cities, and you preach there. Now, other Gospels will tell us they went out by pairs, but they were sent out to preach to each one of these people as they were sent along. And so our question is, why would they not be sent to the Gentiles? Why would they only be sent to the Jews? Well, I've listed 4 reasons here. The Jews would already be prepared. They already understood the Messiah was coming. They were prepared to see a Messiah. They were ready to see him when he came. Also, the apostles were limited in their time. It wasn't like they're going to spend 5 years doing this. They were to go for a certain number of days and then come back. Remember Romans 1:16 says the gospel was to go to the Jews first and later to the Greeks. Number 4, some of it's racism. The Gentiles would not have wanted somebody to come preach to them. Twice in the book of Matthew, Gentiles came to Jesus, but for the most part, they were not ready to see anybody who was coming. And what was their message? You see their message as it comes along. There in verse 7, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. All right? If you remember, that's the same message as John the Baptizer, same message as Jesus, and now their message is the exact same. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. They're able to do miracles. They're able to heal the sick. They're able to raise the dead. They're able to cleanse a leper. And they're able to cast out demons. And as they get ready to go, they were told, just go. Don't pack a bag. Don't bring 2 staffs. Don't get all this material, which we tend to get a lot of times. Just go, right? It's funny. Every once in a while, my wife and I will go on a trip. And if we're only going to stay for one night, it's still hard for us to both pack into one suitcase. And it's only one change of clothes. But for some reason, you're always like, well, what if this happens? Or what if that happens? And you want to pack and you want to bring stuff. Jesus says, don't bring an extra belt to hold money. Don't bring extra money. Don't bring a staff. Don't bring all these extra supplies. You just go and preach, and God will take care of you. God's people will take care of you when you go. Now, a quick aside, why is that a good lesson for us? You ask people, yes, ma'am, Debbie, what you got?
It teaches you not to put so much emphasis on material things. The freer you are from that, the better.
Okay. Yeah, the less stuff you have on you, the freer you are, the more options you would have. Absolutely. If you're getting ready to invite somebody to church, or if you're getting ready to do a Bible study with somebody, you know what's going to happen? Every time you walk up to that person, you're going to find that person's talking to somebody else. And it's just not yet a good time. Or you're going to realize, hey, I could go talk to that person today and invite them to church, but, maybe something's going on and I won't make it to church Sunday. So that'd be embarrassing to invite them to church and not be there. And there's always this excuse and that excuse and that excuse. And I think sometimes we as a church paralyze ourselves because we want to study a little bit more. We want to do a little bit more. We say we're not yet prepared. And what would God be saying? Do it. Just get going. Get busy. Get to work. And so that's what Jesus is telling these men. You go and God is going to take care of whatever it is that you face. You go and you preach and God will take care of whatever it is that's a problem there. All right. Verse 14, you go to somebody's house, they reject you. You're to knock the dust off of your shoes and just go on to the next place. Now, that was a tradition of what Jews did when they left the Gentile area. Even their dirt, even the Gentiles' dirt in their mind was not clean, so they would take a bath and clean their shoes, because they didn't want to be around there. What Jesus is saying is, hey, you preach the gospel. If they don't take it, you're not under obligation to them. You just clean that off and you go find somebody who's worthy to hear the gospel. And you keep teaching them and you keep going as you go along. And he says, but if they reject you, it's worse for them than it will be for Sodom and Gomorrah. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And he says, I want you to know, as I send you out, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. And I want you to be wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. In other words, use your brain. Realize there's a lot of danger when you're out there. Use your mind. Don't allow yourself to become evil, to fight their evil, but use your mind in everything that you're doing. Use your mind in the way that you go. And he said, you're going to be persecuted. First of all, religiously, they're going to take you into the synagogues and beat you. And also civilly, they are going to bring you before kings and other people as well. See, he's still talking a little bit about what's going to happen after Jesus ascends. A lot of these people are going to be arrested, and they're going to be attacked by religious people. But he says, when this happens, do not fear, because these things may be hidden to everybody. People may not know how they've treated you, or may not tell everybody how they've treated you. But in the end, all these things are going to become clear. You just go and you preach. And he says, don't fear him who can destroy your body, but fear him who can what? Destroy your body and soul in hell. In other words, recognize consequences. You ask somebody to come to church, what might they say? What's the worst thing they can say? No, that's dumb, whatever they may say to you. And really, you think about it, that's not the worst thing in the world. Not when you're thinking about consequences of heaven and hell for you and for that person. And so Jesus says, go with that right idea. And so there in verse 32 and 33, whoever confesses me before men, him shall I also confess before God in heaven. And whoever denies me before men, him shall I also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Now, here we go. Jesus says, this is the God of peace. Romans 15:13, the God of hope. Jesus says, though, recognize I did not come to bring peace, but in fact, there's going to be a sword. There will be families who will divide over your preaching about Jesus Christ. And there will be people who will persecute you. There will be people who will lose everything because of their faith in Jesus Christ. But you know what? It's worth it. It is absolutely worth it. Whoever does a kind thing for you, God says, I'll do a kind thing for him. Whoever brings you even a cold cup of water, he will be rewarded in the kingdom. So as you read that, you notice these men are being sent out. And even though we preach a message of love, of grace, of kindness, there's a lot of times people will make a sharp divide, and it will be not just a spiritual war, but a physical war that they will wage against you. And there's times where even people in your own family may do terrible things because you're trying to be faithful to God. And so these men needed to recognize what they were walking into. These apostles needed to recognize what was about to happen to them, and yet they needed to go anyway. They needed to go regardless. I think oftentimes about when it reads about those who do kind to those who preach the word, even a cold cup of water, they'll be rewarded. I remember a lot of times, Russell Epperson will come down. He's a missionary that lives up in Montana. And a lot of people at church will silently give him money. That happens a lot with other missionaries and other people who are working for the kingdom as well. Jesus clearly states, when you do that, there is a big reward that happens. There is a big reward when you help those who are preaching the Word of God. And so that's a neat thing that's there. That's something I like to focus on, and I like to remember as we go through. And so as we finish that, remember the very end of chapter 9. Now we've come to chapter 10. Very end of chapter 9, Jesus has said before he brings all these people out, the harvest is great, the laborers are few. We need more people. Praise the Lord to send out reapers. And then right at that point, we see chapter 10 where he's sending them out. Now chapter 11, and you don't notice this unless you have studied it in context. Chapter 11 explains or illustrates what we just read in chapter 10. All right? But it starts off strange. John the Baptizer, 3 times we've seen in the book of Matthew, he is in jail. Here in a few chapters, we'll see where he's put to death. Now, why was he in jail? The 2 H's, and I can't tell you all of Herod's family tree because it is confusing. It's one of those family trees where sometimes the root or the branches go back down into the root, and you make a few more circuits than you want to, Well, John saw Herod, one of the Herods, who was a ruler, and he told Herod, you're not allowed to be married to your niece, because his niece had been married to his brother. See, here we go with the family tree. The niece had been married to the brother, and then they had divorced because Herod had decided that he wanted this woman. And so Herodias had divorced Herod Antipas and now had married Herod. And it was crazy stuff. And John comes up to him and says, you're not allowed to be married that way. Kind of looking back to Matthew 19, he says, this is an unscriptural marriage. It needs to be broken apart. This is not allowed. And when Herod heard that this man was out there preaching it, he went right out there to the Jordan River and arrested John and put him in jail. And it would not be long until Herod would watch his daughter dance, which is weird on the family tree again, and would have John beheaded. So the rulers are just kind of crazy at this area at this time. But those are some of the things happening. All right, so John is in prison, and John is waiting in prison. And if you look at what Jesus said when he first began preaching at his role, he said he was coming to free the captives. He was coming to bring light to those who are blind. He's coming to free the captives. He was coming to preach to the poor. And John heard that, and John is in jail, and John is a cousin of Jesus, and John is wondering, where is this freeing the captive thing coming from? I'm a captive, come get me. And so John sends a message and says, Jesus, are you the Messiah? Are you the one who is coming? Or should we wait for another? Now, some of this is conjecture. Some commentaries would say that John the Baptizer was trying to push his disciples to follow Jesus instead of him, and maybe that's happening. But looking at context, it looks like John the Baptizer is saying, hey, why am I not out of prison? Why am I being treated this way? I didn't do anything. And that kind of goes back to what we saw preached in Matthew chapter 10, right? You'll preach a pure gospel, but people are going to act in impure ways. And so expect persecution, expect difficulty, expect that sword in your family, in your home, and expect those divisions to come. And so Jesus, hearing these disciples, tells them, I want you to see what I've done. And he summarizes what you see in chapter 9. He summarizes about bringing light to those who are blind, healing the lepers, raising the dead. And he summarizes those miracles which go there. And he says, but I want you to know something. Of all the prophets of the Old Testament, of all the people living, there is no prophet greater than John. Now, maybe hyperbole, but why would John be ranked above Elijah and above Moses and above Jeremiah? Why would he be ranked above Daniel? Why would he be ranked above Noah? Of all those men, who got to look at Jesus and point to him in John 1:29 and say, that's him, listen to him. Jeremiah talked about Jesus, Isaiah talked about Jesus, Moses talked about Jesus. John the Baptizer is like, there he is, that is Jesus. And so he's the greatest. But Jesus then says, but those who are in the kingdom are going to be even greater. Now, why are we who are in the kingdom in a greater position than John? What's our relationship to Jesus? What you got, Don?
We believe without sin.
We believe. Yeah. We're brethren of Jesus. We are connected to Jesus, and we see the full gospel. Those things that the prophets long to look toward, long to look into, now we are right there. And so we have that opportunity. And so what you see as an illustration of Matthew chapter 10, you see a very righteous and a good, very, very good preacher who, even though he didn't do anything wrong, he's in prison and he's about to be put to death. And Jesus says, I know his situation and he is a great person. And he says, I want you to know that you also, when you're preaching in the kingdom, you're going to have difficult times and you're going to be great as well. And so that's pretty good stuff, which is there. Pretty amazing. And then he goes on and he says, Chorazin and Bethsaida, that's where these men had just gone to preach. He said, now this is going to get tough and a little bit intellectual here. It's going to be worse for them in that final day than Tyre and Sidon. It's going to be worse for them in that final day than Sodom and Gomorrah. Because these people had Jesus and the apostles come and preach the gospel. Sodom and Gomorrah had Lot. And although Lot's soul was vexed, we read of in the book of Jude, they didn't listen. Tyre and Sidon had prophets in the Old Testament, but they did not have Jesus and they did not have the apostles. And so the destruction of these good people is going to be worse than the destruction of those who are living in a perverted way. I had a person one time ask me, and he said, okay, somebody in Timbuktu, that was back before we realized Timbuktu was a real place. He says, there's this guy over here in Timbuktu living in the forest. And he is just, hanging out, dancing around his campfire, never heard about Jesus. And he said, he dies. Does he go to heaven? Does he go to hell? That's a tough question right there. And the best answer I know is, I don't know, because I'm not in God's place. God's grace, God's mercy, God's kindness, He knows more than I know, right? Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. But I do know this. His blood somewhat is on my hands, because I am a fairly wealthy person being here in Benton, Kentucky, and I need to make sure the gospel goes to that region of the world. I need to make sure that person has an opportunity to hear the gospel. Now, if you teach that the little fella dancing around the fire in Timbuktu is saved, then the correct answer for what we should do, the eternal answer, is we should not send any missionaries. Because if a person never hears about Jesus and they go to heaven, the best thing, the most kind thing we could do is just not tell them anything about Jesus. And we know that's not the case. That's my circular reasoning right there. And so we have an obligation to teach the gospel to every person, to every nation, to every creature. But what you see here is the people in Chorazin and Bethsaida, they needed to hear the gospel. And when they did, and they disobeyed, imagine the judgment they were under. Now imagine somebody who comes to church and hears the gospel every Sunday and is not obeyed. Imagine somebody who lives in Benton, Kentucky, who lives among Christians and haven't obeyed. Imagine the judgment that's waiting for them. All right, any comment? We usually talk about that a lot. Yes?
Doesn't it tell us that every nation was given the gospel?
Okay,
So
yeah.
it's possible that the person that's in Timbuktu was in a culture that rejected it.
Well, that's right.
And therefore, that's why he.
Yeah, Acts 17:4, the people had turned the world upside down. We read in Colossians that it had gone everywhere to all nations. And so all people have heard it. Many people have rejected it. And it's one of those things where it's kind of happened. I was talking to a fellow who preached here a long, long time ago. And he said, it's hard preaching in Benton, Kentucky, because the ground has been plowed so much. There's such a huge percentage of people who live here who are members of the church or families of members of the church that there's not many people who are open to a Bible study because they already know. That was true in the 80s and the 90s. I don't think it's as true today, at least locally. I think there's a lot of people who have gone generation after generation after generation and have not heard the gospel in its pure form. But you're right. It had at one time gone everywhere, but after a couple of generations, sometimes it falls away. Sometimes it does. I know I've been in a foreign country over in Europe on a mission trip, and one of the things my interpreter told me was, you need to preach the gospel here because your nation's about to fall away, and hopefully in the next generation or two, we'll send missionaries over to your place, and, maybe that will happen. And, so that's a little bit of that idea which was there. Okay, any other ideas, thoughts? You can tell we're at the end of school, All right. So, he says, all things are handed to me, and then he gives the invitation, come all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and you'll learn from me. All right, so then we come to chapter 12, and here we go again. The Sabbath. I'm still at the are you he, are you him. All right, chapter 12, Lord of the Sabbath. The apostles are walking through, they're hungry, so they grab some of the grain as they walk through the field, which you're told you could do in Deuteronomy. They rub it in their hands to get the hulls off. Then they eat it. And the people are like, you can't do that on the Sabbath because that's our tradition. Man has a withered hand. Jesus looks at him and says, you would save a sheep if you fell in a ditch. What do you think about one of the children of God? And they're kind of like, well, no, not really. He's not worth a sheep. Jesus heals him anyway. He's showing that he's Lord of the Sabbath and that he is Lord over all things. And that's what the focus is of chapter 12, is Jesus is Lord. And then as he heals a man who is blind, is mute, and has a demon, The Pharisees say, well, he must be playing for the other team. He must be Beelzebub, which is a move. Beelzebub means Lord of the Summit, which is Baal's name. The Jews called him Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, kind of to make fun of him. You know, he was stinky. And he says, well, he must be from Beelzebub. And Jesus tells him, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. Satan's not going to be casting out Satan. This is showing you that I'm God. And then he goes beyond and talks about, this is why you wait until 3 minutes to the end of class, blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. And we read about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, and we see in the passage here it's something that cannot be forgiven, and it scares us to death. Now, if you look at context, what Jesus is talking about is people who see a clear miracle, see the clear authority of God, and say, I don't care, I'm not going to follow it anyway. I don't care, I'm not going to do any of that. And Jesus says, as long as you have that attitude, you can never be forgiven. Now, today we don't live in a day of miracles, but we do have people who are stubborn. You show them the verse in the Bible and they say, I don't care because my mama told me this, or I don't care because I've always believed this way. And as long as you're stubborn, you cannot be forgiven. You cannot be right with God. Now, that's a quick explanation, but that's what's going on there. If your heart is hurting and you're afraid that perhaps you've committed it, that means you haven't committed it. And so what we see here is something which was more so for the first century, I believe, but it's something which we need to be aware of today as well. And then Jesus says something which I think is funny. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Whatever comes out of here had to go through here first. And so if you find yourself being a bitter person, a gossipy person, a complaining person, a comparing person, that's showing where your heart is. If you're a person who compliments, a person who loves, a person who encourages, that's where your heart is. The fruit of a tree is shown by, or what a tree is shown by its fruit. In the same way, you're shown by the way in which you treat others. And so to finish that part, Jesus has his mother and brothers come to try to take him home, and he looks to the church, looks to the people he's speaking to, and remember that sword again, dividing families. He says, I want you to know the people that are in this group, you're my mothers, you're my brother, you're my sisters. Okay? Not brethren and sistren, brothers and sisters. All right, so that's what church is supposed to be about. We're supposed to be close to one another. We're supposed to encourage one another. When people have family troubles, we need to be able to rely on them and have them take care of us. All right, next week is VBS. We're going to meet in here. We're going to cover something a little bit different. And then the next week, I think, Lord willing, we're starting our summer series. So it'll be a while until we get to Matthew 13. But Lord willing, we'll get there someday. Thank you for being here.